Hello, Schema. Thank you for having us. Today, we're going to talk about research-driven design systems. But before we do that, we're going to talk a little bit about ourselves. So, to start with, I'm Jack. I am married, and I have a beautiful little boy called Rex. Within the last year, I have really gotten into collecting classic comic books. So, if you're into classic Marvel comic books, find me at the end of Schema today, and we can get all geeky. Another interesting fact is, up until a couple of weeks ago, I used to own a replica of the Back to the Future hoverboard, which I purchased after one too many drinks after a work do. I've been at Farfetch for about a year now, and prior to that, I spent 2 years at Babylon Health, where I helped set up and guide the design system there. Before Babylon, I spent 6 years at Tesco's working on a whole range of different products.
Thanks, Jack. And a little bit more about me. So my name is Brice, or Brice, however you want to pronounce it. So I'm a water and nature enthusiast, so that's probably where you'll be finding me in this kind of environments during my free time. I'm also extremely passionate at the intersection of fashion and technology, and also passionate about system thinking to build delightful digital products. Prior to my time at Farfetch, I was a researcher at Samsung, and also at Net-a-Porter and Mr. Porter, which are two leading online luxury businesses.
So today we're going to talk to you about how we've used research to drive the direction of our design system at Farfetch. So if you don't know who Farfetch are, Farfetch were founded in 2007, and we're an e-commerce marketplace for luxury boutiques around the world. It connects customers to over 190 countries and territories, with items from more than 50 countries and over 1,400 of the world's best brands, boutiques, and department stores. Our consumer product design team is over 50 strong. Our team consists of product designers, researchers, service designers, and content designers. So, what did our design system look like? So let's briefly talk about life before Figma. Before the team moved to Figma, there was a fragmented design ecosystem. This was because our team was split between Sketch, Abstract, and Framer. After Figma won the design tool wars, Farfetch finally moved to Figma, scrapping Sketch, Abstract, and Framer altogether. However, the team fragmentation moved with it. The team set themselves up into two separate Figma teams, iOS and web. Documentation within our design system lived within Confluence, and again, was split between web and iOS. It contained information around our foundations, components, contribution processes, and patterns. These example pages that you see on the screen are both about product cards, one for web and one for iOS. And as you can see, the structure and the content was completely different for both, even though they're talking about a similar component. We also had two separate contribution processes for the design system, one for web, one for iOS. We were in the dark, and there was clearly a siloed setup. We had no idea what our designers or engineers thought about the design system, the contribution processes, and who this setup was really for. We also had no idea what the team thought about the move to Figma and how they felt about our overall library setup.
And there was clearly a need to investigate and capture the sentiment on this new setup. So our approach, well, it was Jack's idea, a genius idea. Why don't we involve the UX research team that we actually have internally? But where it was kind of complex is that typically as a UX research team, we talk to users, our customers, not to our colleagues. So how to research this complex internal topic, and how did we actually set up this research? Typically, when we practice UX research, we have two sets of research approaches. One, which we call discovery research, or more generative research, which is really about studying the user from a contextual aspect. So it's not about focusing on the user from their interaction with the actual digital product. It's what is their environment looking like around this digital product. And on the other end, there is what we call evaluative research, which I'm sure you've all engaged with in the past, which is about the interaction with the actual product and trying to understand how is this user actually using this product and trying to uncover a certain set of usability pinpoints to improve and maintain the digital product. So one is about zooming out, and the other one is about zooming in. So this is typically what we would do within the UX research team with our customers, understanding their wider luxury ecosystem, and then trying to understand their interaction with Farfetch and how do they actually shop on Farfetch. So we got inspired, but we had to curate this approach, to build this phase approach, to get a full understanding of the sentiment of our design system. But again, this time our audience was completely different. It was not our customer. It was our colleagues. So how did we adapt this? First, we wanted to look at the product context. So what matters to our teams when it comes to a design system? And this is really where we wanted to deep dive into the ways of working of our colleagues, and how is this design system coming into place in their day-to-day. Second of all was kind of exploring the product context setting. What do they think it should look like? And the current sentiment on the current setup. So this is where we were moving towards evaluative research. And then lastly was exploring what is the experience of a refresh experience. Once we capture all those learnings from the research and we can actually implement them, how do they actually feel about the implementation of the recommendations and the refresh? But to start with, we had to focus on those two elements. Because going back to what Jack was saying, we were in the dark. We didn't really know what their day-to-day looked like, and we didn't know what they felt about their current setup. So we had to set up the research. But as a UX researcher, I'm certainly not an expert in design systems. I don't know who's working on the design system. I work with our customers every day. I support the design team, but I'm not part of their day-to-day. So Jack helped me to identify the panel. Who am I going to be interviewing? And there's two sets of users within the business when it comes to the design system. There is designers and engineers. So we recruited 17 designers and engineers that we were going to interview. And on the back of that, what we wanted to do as well is start kind of recruiting different types of level, juniors, mid-weight, senior levels, to make sure we were getting an accurate representation of how they actually use the design system. And the type of questions we really wanted to ask them is, how do they use this new setup? What are their needs? What currently doesn't work for them? What does it enable across the two domains? And what can we ultimately improve? But we also had to set up the right interview framework. So Jack and myself crafted the discussion guides, making sure we're identifying the right themes that we wanted to deep dive into and get the right type of feedback and asking the right questions. We also wanted to shadow real-work situations with our colleagues, whether that was through Zoom calls and asking them to actually share their screens and just seeing what they're just working on at the moment, and just seeing how is their Figma setup, how are they actually utilizing their design library in a live case scenario. But lastly, and certainly the most important factor for this research, was creating a safe space for honest feedback. Because what we wanted to make sure is that our colleagues didn't feel like they were being assessed by us engaging with them and asking them a set of questions, that we are actually looking for genuine feedback. We were looking for criticism, and that's what we needed to get out of them. We wanted to make sure they could be as honest as possible, because this is how we could improve the way we would be using our design system. But once we captured all those insights, we had to start identifying the patterns. What is the recurrent pattern, and what are the opportunities and the pain points that our colleagues are going through? So we created a matrix where we started to capture all those user insights and bucket them into multiple themes to trying to identify the different levels of patterns and the different types of insights we were capturing. But within this collaboration between Jack and myself, between UX design and UX research, the most important thing is that it was a transfer of skills between us two. I was not a design system expert, but I was a research expert. And Jack was a design system expert, but he was not a research expert. So really, the opportunity for us within this collaboration was actually to transfer each other's skills, to support each other, and making sure we could improve the current setup of our design system. So what did we learn? To start with, our two user groups, designs and engineers, actually had very similar needs, to our surprise. Both of them used a design system for speed of delivery, designing at scale and fast. But also what we uncovered is that they're using this current setup to build a common language, to make sure that engineers and designs could actually communicate with each other.
At the beginning, we were under the impression that there were just two sources of documentation, but what we found was that there was actually multiple sources. Engineering had their own documentation that wasn't linked to the design system documentation. As you can see from the slide, we had a design system documentation within Confluence for web and iOS, which was created by designers. We had Confluence for mobile engineering, which was just being used by our iOS engineers, and we had Storybook for web engineering. None of these were working together, and none of them were linked. One user from our mobile engineering interviews told us that they never refer to the design system documentation because the mobile engineering documentation has all the information that they required. We had separate library setups in Figma. Each team had their own theme library, which contained the foundations for each platform. And what we also found was that actually the theme libraries were completely identical between iOS and web, so we had a lot of duplication there. We also found that web had an extra layer within their setup called modules, which were essentially more complex components. Because of the siloed setups, there were different category and component namings. There were multiple people contributing to these, which led to inconsistencies throughout. One library even had a category called Other, which was really confusing to the team. And if you see the bottom quote, different people have different way of naming, more than one way to name things to quickly find things. So that kind of gives you a bit of a context of the problem that we had. A large problem we found was Figma wasn't being used for component specifications. Instead, the team were uploading image specs to a documentation for engineers to refer to. Designers were telling us how long this process would take, while engineers were telling us that they wanted to use Figma for inspect instead, because they could see how long it would take for designers to create the images and upload them. And if the engineers pointed out an error, they realized that designers would have to go back to those images, recreate them, and upload them again. There were missing components for not only web and iOS, but one thing that really surprised us was that we were missing components for Android and documentation. The users told us that we needed a team or someone responsible to focus on those missing components and addressing these issues. Away from the design system, our users highlighted issues with handoff. Designers had to create separate files for engineering to pick up. This was mentioned by every participant as a huge pain point. Design work was effectively sat on a shelf waiting for engineering to pick it up.
But what we uncovered also is that there was a very lengthy design system onboarding. Our onboarding process consisted of 2 separate 1-hour sessions with 2 principals. And those 2 principal designers were the only ones that could do the design system onboarding. So clearly, we had to simplify that process as well. And it was particularly difficult for new joiners as well. And here are a couple quotes that we captured for some of our more junior members. Some said, understanding the difference between the libraries, I think I get it now, but it can be confusing for new joiners. And some others said, if you're new, it's hard to understand everything. So clearly, we were wasting a lot of time as well to onboard all those new designers to this setup. And not only that, there were many points of view on what the design system should be. Some told us it should be a standalone website, a singular destination that I can go to. Some would tell us just improve the design libraries. So there were so many different point of views that we actually had to realign the team as well in terms of what it could be.
Many of our users suggested just using Figma for lightweight documentation. They suggested that Figma should just contain do and don'ts with more detailed documentation moving to Confluence. However, some of our users had a fear of changing design tools again, so we're very much against this idea of documentation living within Figma. All of our participants had a very different view on the existing documentation, but they all agreed that the content and structure that we had needed to be reassessed. The engineers that we interviewed all mentioned reducing the amount of images that we showed within Confluence and instead using Figma as a reference point. All of our users mentioned the need for a dedicated design system team. Not having a central team responsible for the design system was causing issues, especially with the communication between design and engineering. Without a dedicated team, there was effectively no one responsible to drive the system forward. But it wasn't all bad. In fact, there was a lot of good things happening. We had component libraries that pretty much matched with what we had in engineering. We had documentation, and we had contribution processes. Everyone agreed that just having what we had for Farfetch was a good thing.
So now we're going to walk you through the opportunities based on the research findings. Because like Jack said, it wasn't all bad. And those research findings could be turned from being a tension point to a set of opportunities and improvements. So we started to bucket in different themes what we could actually improve. One, it was about creating a one-system approach for our design system and current setup. Also, improving and building consistent and logical naming. Then we were thinking about improving the onboarding experience. And lastly, the documentation strategy. But we had to be really realistic about what we could actually do and what would require a high impact versus low effort. So we started to bucket things into quick wins and things were long-term wins. And we'll focus now on the quick wins.
Cool, thank you, Brice. So what we'll go through now is the immediate changes that we could make to the team. To start with, we created a single system approach within Figma. To do this, we transferred our libraries to a new design system team. We then created a single foundations library that would provide the foundations for all new and existing libraries. This approach effectively gave us and the team a single location to go to for all Figma components and effectively removing library silos. We then started looking at creating a common and consistent language, and this was something we could start with immediately. To begin with, we worked with design and engineering to effectively look at component category namings. We took an asynchronous approach to this because we wanted to give every team member within design and engineering the opportunity to add their feedback. So, what's happening now? We're working with our content designers, Daniel and Louise, to define the future direction of our documentation. However, for this to succeed, we will need to undertake more research to uncover the type of content our teams require and the tooling they may need, as well as how the system works as a whole. One of our design principals, Nadia, is looking at how we can restructure our Figma team setup to help us move away from platform silos within Figma. As well as that, Nadia is helping to construct a space for our self-service design system onboarding. Luckily, we're now forming a team that will look at the design system. Our users were proposing a team focused on the design system. They wanted a team that they could reach out to for support. This also means that we have people that can focus on improving the system and setting its direction. But then we had the unique opportunity to test our findings with Android.
And if you can remember, during our three-phased approach, there was the last bit, which was product evaluation, but actually testing the improvements based on the past research findings. And this is where we had a unique opportunity to move into our last stage of the research, and again, testing and implementing our research findings.
So, historically, Android was seen as the lower end of the mobile market, which we all know is no longer the case, especially at Farfetch. Android was a big growth opportunity for Farfetch, so we needed to invest in the design system. Previously, the business had been more focused on web and iOS, as you can see from the previous slides. It was effectively a no-brainer for the business to fully invest in Android. Our users had already informed us that there was nothing for Android, which effectively gave us a blank canvas to apply our findings. So we had the opportunity to test, learn, and shape the Android setup. Luckily, our research was already having an impact with the quick wins that we'd made. Because of the new single system approach we'd made in Figma, Android library could instantly use all the foundations. This would allow us to move quicker when creating new components, and we could point our Android engineers to the Farfetch foundations that were being used by iOS and Android so we can ensure things were consistent. The team had informed us that they wanted key pieces of information kept within Figma to prevent them leaving the tool. By placing components within frames, this meant we could apply details on how it works, external links to documentation, and best practice guidance. It also meant that engineers would use Figma for component specifications. We wanted to prevent siloed documentation, so we informed the Android engineers of our plan to use Figma as a documentation source, which they agreed with and really liked. But we also wanted to know what tools they had. We uncovered that they had tools called a gallery app and a feature called designer goggles. The gallery app effectively contained all the live components that were being used for our Android, while the designer goggles was a feature on the alpha build of the app, which allowed us to enter an inspect mode within the app so we could see type sizes, spacing, color values, etc. And here are just a few components based on what was in the gallery app, which were then translated to Figma. Our research informed us how lengthy the onboarding process was at Farfetch. So we decided to include details within the Android library itself. It explained why documentation was living in Figma, the contribution process, and how to install emulators. We wanted new and existing designers to feel like they could just jump straight in and start working with Android without having to find resources for documentation. There were improvements, however, that required longer-term thinking. People have been used to contributing to the design system at Farfetch in a specific way. For example, uploading image specs to Confluence. Some of these habits, again, come from a fear of changing design tools and want to keep all the documentation agnostic from the design tool itself. But we have the opportunity to change the team's habits and highlight why change is a good thing and how it can benefit the team. We're proposing the single system approach in Figma, but what does that look like outside of Figma? How do we completely move away from silos? What does a community interacting together really look like at Farfetch? How does Figma, our documentation, contribution process, and onboarding all work together? So, our final thoughts. Bring your team along with you and treat them as real users. I found this image of Kermit the Frog and Fozzie from the Muppets movie. And in this clip, they're singing Moving Right Along, which they sing, "Getting there is half the fun, come share it with me." So tools are used by real humans, real people. By using research, the research process, you're able to make real changes and impact your design system.
And I'll end with this question. If you don't understand your team, can you actually deliver an effective system? Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.